The dry Dakota Territory wind whipped dust across the plains as Madeline Tucker fought for every breath, her lungs seizing with each desperate gasp. The journey west had been punishing, but nothing compared to the fever that now ravaged her body as she collapsed at the edge of a small creek, miles from the nearest settlement. Her vision blurred as a silhouette appeared on horseback against the setting sun, a stranger whose approach might mean salvation or doom in this unforgiving frontier. It was 1878, and the promise of land and opportunity had drawn Madeline away from her comfortable life in Boston following the death of her parents. At 22, she had inherited enough to start anew, but the stagecoach robbery 3 days prior had left her stranded, wandering with only the clothes on her back and a small water canteen that had emptied hours ago. The dust and exhaustion had triggered a coughing fit that wouldn't relent. The horseman dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat as he approached cautiously. "Miss, you all right?" His voice carried the rough edges of the frontier, but there was genuine concern beneath it. Madeline tried to respond, but another violent coughing fit doubled her over. She felt strong hands gently supporting her shoulders, easing her to sit against a sun-warmed rock. "Here now," he said, reaching for his canteen. "Let's get some water in you." The stranger knelt beside her, one arm around her shoulders as he brought the canteen to her cracked lips. When she choked on the first sip, he pulled it away slightly. "Easy," he whispered, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Small sips, miss, that's it." As her coughing subsided, Madeline finally got a clear look at her rescuer. His face was tanned by the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into harsh prairie light. He wasn't old, perhaps 30, but life out here aged a person quickly. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, watched her with concern. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. "I thought I might die out here." "Not on my watch," he replied with the hint of a smile. "Name's Kieran Calloway. I've got a small place about an hour's ride from here." "Madeline Tucker," she replied, attempting to straighten her dusty traveling dress. "I was on the Deadwood stage when the robbery," he finished, nodding grimly. "Word spread. 3 dead, they said. 4, she corrected softly. The driver succumbed to his wounds before help arrived." Kieran's expression darkened. "Damn shame. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Tucker." "Madeline, please," she said, taking another careful sip of water when he offered it. "And yes, I know, they let the women go, took everything we had." He assessed her condition with a critical eye. "You've got fever, likely from exposure and exhaustion. Can you ride? My place isn't fancy, but it's shelter, and my housekeeper makes a tea that'll help with that cough." Madeline hesitated, considering her options. A woman alone with a strange man was improper at best, dangerous at worst. But the alternative was certain death on the plains. "I can ride," she affirmed, though uncertainty laced her voice. Kieran seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Wilkins, my housekeeper, will fuss over you something fierce. Been like a mother to me since I came west. You'll be proper as Sunday church." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Kieran," he corrected, helping her to her feet. When her knees buckled, he caught her with steady hands. "Whoa there, maybe riding solo isn't the best idea." Before she could protest, he whistled for his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that trotted obediently to his side. With surprising gentleness, Kieran lifted Madeline onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. "Lean back if you need to," he said, reaching around her to take the reins. "It's not a short ride." As they set off across the open prairie, Madeline fought to stay upright, but the fever and exhaustion soon had her head resting against Kieran's chest. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the cowboy behind her lulled her into a fitful half-sleep punctuated by coughing spells. Each time she started coughing, Kieran would slow the horse, offer water, and whisper that same gentle, easy until the fit passed. There was something in that word, in the way he said it, that calmed her racing heart. The sun was setting when they crested a small hill, revealing a modest ranch nestled in a protected valley. A creek wound through pastureland where cattle grazed, and a sturdy two-story house stood flanked by a barn and several outbuildings. "Calloway Ranch," Kieran said. "Not much, but it's home." As they approached, a plump woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as they drew closer. "Kieran James Calloway, who is this poor creature and what happened to her?" she called out, hurrying to meet them. "Found her by Cottonwood Creek, Mrs. Wilkins. Stage robbery survivor." "Fever and a bad cough," he explained, sliding from the saddle before helping Madeline down. Mrs. Wilkins immediately took charge, clucking disapprovingly as she assessed Madeline. "Skin and bones and burning up. Inside with you, miss. I've got stew on and a spare bed upstairs." "Thank you," Madeline managed before another coughing fit seized her. Kieran scooped her into his arms without hesitation. "Arguing with Mrs. Wilkins is pointless," he informed her with a wink. "Learned that my first day here." "As well you should have," the older woman sniffed, leading the way into the house. "Put her in the blue room. I'll fetch my medicines." The blue room proved to be a modest but comfortable bedroom with whitewashed walls, simple furniture, and curtains the color of a summer sky. Kieran placed Madeline gently on the bed, then stepped back awkwardly. "Mrs. Wilkins will get you settled. I'll see to the horse and be back to check on you." After he left, Mrs. Wilkins returned with a tray bearing a steaming cup and a bowl of water with cloths. "Wild cherry bark and honey," she explained, helping Madeline sit up to drink the tea. "Best thing for a cough. Now, let's get you out of these filthy traveling clothes." Despite her protests that she could manage, Madeline was too weak to do more than comply as the motherly woman helped her change into a borrowed nightgown, washed the dust from her face and hands, and tucked her into bed with cool compresses for her fever. "Poor lamb," Mrs. Wilkins murmured. "Been through quite an ordeal, haven't you? Rest now, the tea will help you sleep." Sleep came swiftly, but it was troubled by nightmares, the stagecoach attack replaying in horrific detail. The shots, the screams, the bandit's face leering down at her as he tore the locket from her neck, the only keepsake of her mother she possessed. Madeline woke gasping and coughing in the dark, disoriented until a match struck and a lamp illuminated Kieran's concerned face. He was seated in a chair by her bed, a book open on his lap. "Bad dreams?" he asked softly, reaching for the water pitcher. "The robbery," she whispered, accepting the glass he offered. "It keeps coming back." Kieran nodded in understanding. "War dreams were like that for me. Took years before they faded." "You fought in the war?" she asked, grateful for the distraction. "Joined up in '64, last year, thank God." His expression clouded. "Was barely 18, too young to see such things." A coughing spell interrupted her reply, and he was immediately attentive, supporting her as she struggled to breathe. "Easy," he murmured, the word becoming a talisman between them. "Breathe slow if you can." When the fit subsided, she noticed the book in his lap. "What were you reading?" He looked almost embarrassed. "Tennyson. Poetry helps when sleep won't come." Madeline smiled genuinely for the first time since her arrival. "Would you read some? My father used to read poetry on winter evenings." Kieran hesitated, then nodded, opening the book to a marked page. His voice, so commanding in the daylight, softened as he read about brave Ulysses and his determination to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. The words and his gentle cadence soothed Madeline back to sleep, this time without nightmares. The next 3 days passed in a haze of fever and coughing. Mrs. Wilkins was a constant presence, coaxing broths and teas into her, while Kieran appeared regularly to check on her progress, sometimes reading poetry when night terrors woke her. On the 4th morning, Madeline woke feeling markedly better. Her fever had broken, and though the cough persisted, it was less violent. She managed to dress in a simple dress Mrs. Wilkins had altered for her and made her way downstairs. The main room of the house combined a kitchen and living area. Large windows let in the morning light, illuminating bookshelves that lined one wall, unusual for a ranch house on the frontier. Mrs. Wilkins was kneading bread at the table, and she looked up with a pleased expression. "Well now, look who's on her feet. Feeling better, are we?" "Much," Madeline confirmed, though she kept a steadying hand on the banister. "I can't thank you enough for your care." "Nonsense. Couldn't leave you to suffer." The older woman gestured to a chair. "Sit before you fall. Kieran's out with the herd, but he'll be pleased to see you up and about." Madeline sat, observing the cozy home. "Have you been with Mr. Calloway long?" "5 years now," Mrs. Wilkins replied, turning the dough onto a floured board. "Came with my husband when Kieran first bought this place. After John passed last winter, Kieran insisted I stay on." "He seems very kind," Mrs. Wilkins smiled knowingly. "He is that, too kind for his own good sometimes. Man needs a wife, but he's buried himself out here instead of looking." Before Madeline could respond to this rather direct observation, the door opened and Kieran entered, bringing the scent of horses and open air with him. He stopped short at the sight of Madeline at the table. "You're up," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's good to see." "Thanks to your and Mrs. Wilkins' excellent care," Madeline replied, suddenly aware of her borrowed dress and loose hair. "Least we could do." He removed his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "How's the cough?" As if summoned, a brief coughing spell seized her. Kieran was immediately at her side with a cup of water, his hand steady on her back. "Easy," he murmured, the familiar reassurance wrapping around her like a blanket. When she recovered, Madeline was acutely aware of his proximity and the concern in his eyes. Something fluttered in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. "Better every day," she assured him, taking a careful breath. "I was just telling Mrs. Wilkins how grateful I am. You're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered," he said, taking a seat across from her. "We don't get many visitors out here." "I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted, sliding the bread into the oven. "Where would you go? The nearest town is 2 days' ride, and you're in no condition for that journey." Kieran nodded in agreement. "Besides, I telegraphed the marshal in Deadwood about the robbery. He'll want to speak with you when he comes this way." Madeline's expression fell. "I fear I won't be much help. Everything happened so quickly and I was terrified. Any details might help," Kieran said gently. "They've hit 3 stages in the past month, getting bolder each time." Mrs. Wilkins made a disapproving noise. "Enough of such talk at breakfast. Kieran, wash up while I fry some eggs. Miss Tucker needs proper food to regain her strength." Over the next week, Madeline's health steadily improved. The violent coughing fits became less frequent, though they still seized her occasionally, especially in the dry afternoon air. She began helping Mrs. Wilkins with light household tasks, grateful to be useful after so much care. Kieran was often busy with ranch work, but he made time each evening to sit with Madeline on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in golds and pinks. He told her about his journey west after the war, how he'd worked cattle drives until he saved enough to buy this small spread, and his dreams of expanding it someday. "What brought you west, if you don't mind my asking?" he inquired one evening as they sat watching distant lightning flicker on the horizon. "Boston to Dakota Territory is quite a leap." Madeline considered the question, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her borrowed shawl. "After my parents died, influenza took them both last winter. There was nothing left for me there. I taught at a small school, but the memories." She sighed. "I saw an advertisement for teachers needed in Deadwood. New place, new beginnings." "That takes courage," Kieran observed. "Most young ladies wouldn't venture west alone." "I'm finding I'm braver than I knew," she replied with a small smile. "Though perhaps foolhardy as well. I wasn't prepared for the journey's hardships. Few are their first time west." A comfortable silence fell between them before he added, "You still want to teach in Deadwood?" Madeline hesitated. "I don't know. The position may be filled by now, and I've lost everything: my luggage, letters of recommendation, what little money I had." "We could write to the school board," Kieran suggested. "Explain what happened." Perhaps, she agreed, though uncertainty colored her voice. The prospect of continuing to Deadwood no longer held the same appeal, and she wasn't sure if it was the trauma of the robbery or the unexpected comfort she'd found at Calloway Ranch. The next morning, Madeline was helping Mrs. Wilkins in the garden when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared on the road, the lead figure sporting a marshal's badge that glinted in the sunlight. Kieran emerged from the barn to greet them, exchanging handshakes before gesturing toward the house. Mrs. Wilkins hurriedly removed her gardening gloves. "That'll be Marshal Hayes about the robbery," she explained. "Let's get you inside and presentable, dear." The marshal was a weathered man with a silver mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing as he was introduced to Madeline. His deputies remained outside while Mrs. Wilkins provided coffee and the marshal took a seat at the kitchen table. "Miss Tucker, I understand you were on the Deadwood stage when it was robbed," he began without preamble. "I need to hear everything you remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Madeline took a steadying breath, grateful when Kieran took a seat beside her, his presence reassuring. "There were 6 of us passengers plus the driver and shotgun guard," she began, forcing herself to revisit the terrifying memory. She described how the stage had been stopped at a narrow pass, how 5 masked men had emerged from the rocks above, firing without warning. The guard had been killed instantly, the driver mortally wounded. Among the passengers, 2 businessmen had resisted and been shot for their trouble. The leader, she continued, her voice growing stronger, had a distinctive scar along his right hand from wrist to knuckle. He wore a black bandana, but his eyes were pale gray or light blue. When he spoke, he had an unusual accent, southern but not quite. Marshal Hayes looked up sharply from his notes. Appellation, maybe, Madeline considered this. Perhaps. He seemed educated in his speech, despite the rough manner. Anything else unusual about him or the others? She closed her eyes, trying to recall details through the haze of terror. One was very young, hardly more than a boy. The leader called him pup when he was rough with one of the women. "And they took everything? All baggage and valuables?" "Everything," she confirmed, hand rising unconsciously to her throat. "Even a locket that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't valuable silver, not gold, but it was all I had of her." Kieran's hand moved to cover hers on the table, a gesture of comfort that didn't go unnoticed by the marshal. "This matches what we've heard from other survivors," Hayes said, closing his notebook. "The Hawkins gang, we believe, led by Elias Hawkins, former Confederate irregular. He's gathered a nasty crew, mostly young men with nowhere else to go after the war." "You'll catch them?" Madeline asked. The marshal's expression was grim. "We're tracking them. They've killed 7 people now across 3 territories. Problem is, they don't stay in one place." "What about the stolen items?" Kieran asked. "Miss Tucker lost everything she owned." "If we recover anything, we'll return it to the rightful owners," Hayes promised, though his tone suggested this was unlikely. "Miss Tucker, the stage company has a small compensation fund for robbery victims." "Not much, but enough perhaps for passage back east, if that's your wish." Madeline glanced at Kieran, then back to the marshal. "I was headed to Deadwood to take a teaching position." "Deadwood's a rough place for a lady alone," Hayes observed. "Though they do need teachers badly enough, they might still hold the position." He rose to leave. "I'll be passing through Deadwood tomorrow. I could inquire for you." "Thank you, Marshal. I would appreciate that." After the lawman departed, an uncomfortable silence fell in the kitchen. The prospect of Madeline's departure hung between them like an unwelcome guest. "You'll be wanting to continue your journey then?" Mrs. Wilkins finally asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I don't know," Madeline admitted. "I came west for a fresh start, but now." She trailed off, uncertain how to express her conflicted feelings. "You're welcome here for as long as you need," Kieran said quietly. "No rush to decide." That evening, Madeline found herself unable to sleep, the marshal's visit having stirred up both memories of the robbery and questions about her future. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way downstairs, intending to make some of Mrs. Wilkins' herbal tea. She found Kieran already in the kitchen, staring into a cup of his own. He looked up, surprise and something else flickering in his eyes at the sight of her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, rising to pull out a chair for her. "Too many thoughts," she confirmed, taking the offered seat. "About what happens next?" Kieran nodded, pouring her a cup of tea from the pot on the stove. "Decisions don't get easier just because the sun goes down." "No," she agreed, accepting the cup gratefully, "though sometimes night brings clarity that daylight obscures." He smiled slightly at that. "Poetic. I've been reading your books," she admitted. "You have quite the collection for a cattle rancher." "Books were my escape during the war," Kieran explained, his voice softening with memory. "When I came west, I couldn't leave them behind. They remind me there's beauty and thought beyond the immediate concerns of survival." Madeline studied him in the lamplight, seeing beyond the rugged cowboy to the thoughtful man beneath. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you riding toward me." "What did you expect?" "I don't know." "Someone rougher, less." She searched for the word, gentle. Their eyes met across the table, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Kieran's hand moved toward hers, hesitated, then completed its journey, his calloused fingers brushing her knuckles. "Madeline," he began, but whatever he intended to say was interrupted as she succumbed to another coughing fit. Immediately, he was at her side, supporting her, offering water with that whispered easy that had become their connection. When the spell passed, she found herself nearly in his arms, his face close enough that she could see flecks of darker blue in his eyes. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, carefully, as if handling something infinitely precious, Kieran brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't want you to go to Deadwood," he said simply, honestly. "Why?" she whispered, though she knew the answer, felt it in the quickening of her own pulse. "Because in 2 weeks, you've brought more light to this house than it's seen in years." His voice roughened. "Because I find myself watching the road when you're out walking, counting the minutes until you return. Because the thought of you leaving makes it hard to breathe." Madeline's heart pounded as she realized her own feelings mirrored his. This man who had saved her life had, without her noticing, begun to claim her heart as well. "I've been wondering," she said softly, "if perhaps my journey wasn't meant to end in Deadwood at all." Kieran's smile was slow but brilliant. "Mrs. Wilkins would be overjoyed if you stayed. She's grown quite fond of you." "And you?" Madeline asked, emboldened by the night and the intimacy of the moment. Instead of answering with words, Kieran leaned forward, his eyes asking permission. When she didn't pull away, he closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Madeline responded with a fervor that surprised them both, her hands rising to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both were breathing as if they'd run a great distance. "Does that answer your question?" Kieran asked, his voice husky. A small laugh escaped her. "Quite thoroughly." They might have continued, but the creak of a floorboard overhead reminded them of Mrs. Wilkins' presence. Kieran reluctantly put a proper distance between them, though his eyes never left Madeline's face. "I should let you rest," he said, "but perhaps tomorrow we might talk more about your future plans." "I'd like that very much," she replied, already knowing that whatever those plans might be, she wanted them to include this man who had rescued her in more ways than one. The next morning brought Marshal Hayes back to the ranch, this time alone and bearing news. The school board in Deadwood was still holding the teaching position for Madeline, desperate as they were for qualified educators, but there was more urgent information. "We've tracked the Hawkins gang to an abandoned mine about 30 miles north of here," he explained over coffee. "I've gathered a posse in town, but I wanted to let you know we might recover some of the stolen items." Kieran's expression was serious. "How many men do you have?" "8, counting myself and deputies," Hayes replied. "Hawkins has 5, maybe 6. Make it 9, Kieran said firmly. "I'm coming with you." Madeline's heart clenched with fear. "Kieran, no, these men are killers." He turned to her, his jaw set in determination. "Which is exactly why they need to be stopped. I won't have you or anyone else living in fear of traveling these roads." The marshal studied Kieran appraisingly. "Could use a good man. You served in the war, Calloway, Union cavalry, last year of fighting," Kieran confirmed. "I can handle myself." Despite Madeline's protests and Mrs. Wilkins' vocal disapproval, Kieran was resolute. He would ride with the posse when the marshal returned with his men the following morning. That evening, after Mrs. Wilkins had retired, Madeline found Kieran on the porch cleaning his rifle. She sat beside him on the bench, her presence a silent accusation. "I have to go," he said without looking up. "You understand that, don't you?" "I understand you feel you must," she replied carefully. "But these past weeks have shown me how precious life is, how quickly it can be taken. I've lost too many people I care about already." Kieran set aside the rifle, turning to face her fully. "Madeline, I can't build a life here, a life I hope you'll share, if I'm not willing to make it safe. What kind of man would I be if I let others take all the risks?" "A living one," she retorted, but there was no real heat in her words. She understood duty and principle, even as she feared their consequences. Kieran took her hands in his. "I'll come back to you, that's a promise." "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep," she whispered, tears threatening. In response, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, carved wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it since she died, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Madeline's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. "Kieran, we've known each other such a short time. Some things you just know," he said simply. "I'm not asking for an answer now, just something for you to think about while I'm gone, something for me to come back to." He closed the box and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it. Then he kissed her, a kiss that held both promise and farewell. Morning came too soon. The marshal arrived with his posse just after dawn, a mixture of lawmen and determined citizens armed with rifles and revolvers. Kieran, dressed in practical riding clothes with his cavalry pistol on his hip and rifle in its scabbard, stood in the yard saying his goodbyes. Mrs. Wilkins fussed over his provisions, slipping extra biscuits into his saddlebags while pretending she wasn't worried sick. Madeline stood nearby, her face pale but composed, determined to be brave for him. When the time came to leave, Kieran drew her slightly apart from the others. 3 days, he said. 4 at most. If the marshal's information is good, we'll have this finished quickly. Madeline nodded, forcing a smile. I'll be here. Keep that box safe for me, he said, his voice low with emotion. We have things to discuss when I return. Be careful, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. Count on it. Then he was mounting his horse, taking his place among the posse. The marshal gave the order to move out, and Madeline watched until they disappeared over the horizon, her hand clutched around the wooden box in her pocket. The waiting was interminable. Mrs. Wilkins kept them both busy with household tasks, but every passing hour stretched their nerves tighter. On the second day, a sudden summer storm blew in from the west, bringing driving rain and worry about the men caught out in it. They'll have found shelter, Mrs. Wilkins assured Madeline as they watched lightning fork across the darkened sky. Kieran knows this country better than most. What if they were already engaged with the gang when the storm hit? Madeline couldn't help asking. What if someone's injured with no doctor? The older woman placed a comforting hand on her arm. That boy has survived worse than a thunderstorm. He fought through the war, drove cattle across half the West, and built this ranch from nothing. He'll come back to you. On the morning of the 4th day, Madeline was hanging laundry when the sound of approaching horses made her heart leap. She shaded her eyes against the sun, counting the riders as they appeared on the road. 6, 7, 8. Her breath caught when she didn't immediately see Kieran among them. Then, riding slightly behind, a 9th figure appeared, and she recognized the chestnut stallion and the straight-backed rider upon it. Mrs. Wilkins, she called, already running toward the approaching group. They're back, Kieran's with them. The posse rode into the yard, men weary and trail-worn but with the satisfied air of those who have completed a difficult task. Marshal Hayes dismounted first, tipping his hat to Madeline. "Your man's a credit to you, Miss Tucker," he said. "Cool head in a tight spot." Then Kieran was there, swinging down from his horse, and Madeline didn't care about propriety or the watching men as she threw herself into his arms. He caught her, lifting her off her feet in a fierce embrace. "You're safe," she breathed against his neck. "Thank God you're safe." "Told you I'd come back," he replied, setting her down but keeping an arm around her waist. There was a fresh cut across his left cheek and exhaustion in his eyes, but he was whole and alive. Marshal Hayes cleared his throat. "Might want to see what we recovered, Miss Tucker." One of the deputies stepped forward with a canvas sack. "Found these among their loot. Recognized your description of the locket." With trembling fingers, Madeline opened the sack. Inside was a small leather-bound journal she'd kept during her journey west. A few articles of clothing and, miraculously, the silver locket with her mother's portrait inside. "My locket," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes as she lifted it out. The chain was broken, but the locket itself was undamaged. "I never thought I'd see it again." "There's more," Kieran said, his voice serious. "We got them, Madeline, all of them. Hawkins and his men won't terrorize anyone else." She looked up sharply. "You mean?" "2 dead resisting arrest," the marshal confirmed grimly. "The others, including Hawkins, in custody. They'll stand trial in Deadwood next month." Mrs. Wilkins emerged from the house with coffee and food for the returning men. While the posse rested and recounted their successful mission, Kieran led Madeline to their spot on the porch, away from prying eyes. "I had a lot of time to think while we were tracking them," he said, taking her hands in his. "About what I want in life, what matters most." "And what did you decide?" Madeline asked, her heart pounding. "That I don't want to waste another day without you by my side." He drew the wooden box from his pocket. "I know it's fast. I know you came west with other plans, but I'm asking if you'll consider making new plans. With me." He opened the box, revealing the gold band. "Madeline Tucker, will you marry me?" Madeline looked from the ring to his earnest face, thinking of how fate had brought her, coughing and desperate, into his path. How his gentle easy had calmed her through her illness. How in just weeks he had become the center of her world. "Yes," she said simply, joyfully. "Yes, I will." Kieran's face lit with a smile as bright as the Dakota sunrise. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close for a kiss that sealed their promise from the doorway. Mrs. Wilkins watched with satisfaction before discreetly retreating to give them privacy. The marshal, mounting up with his men to continue to Deadwood, nodded approvingly at the scene on the porch. "Looks like we've got something to celebrate," he called. "Shall I tell the school board in Deadwood they need to keep looking for a teacher?" Madeline turned in Kieran's embrace, her decision made with absolute certainty. "Yes, Marshal. It seems I've found where I belong." 6 weeks later, Madeline stood in the blue bedroom that had sheltered her during her illness, now transformed with flowers and ribbons for her wedding day. Mrs. Wilkins fussed with the simple white dress they had made together, adjusting the lace collar and smoothing the fabric. "Never thought I'd see this day," the older woman said, blinking away tears. "That boy needed someone special, and the good Lord sent you tumbling right into his path." "Or me into his," Madeline replied with a smile, touching the repaired silver locket that hung around her neck. "I came west looking for a new beginning, but I never imagined finding this." The small church in the nearest town was filled with neighboring ranchers and their families, curious to see the Boston schoolteacher who had captured Kieran Calloway's heart. The marshal, passing through on official business, had agreed to stand as witness. When Madeline walked down the aisle on the arm of Kieran's foreman, standing in for a father, her eyes found her groom waiting at the altar. The look on his face, wonder, love, and absolute certainty chased away any lingering doubts she might have harbored about their swift courtship. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Madeline felt the rightness of the moment settle in her soul. The vows were simple and heartfelt. When Kieran promised to love and cherish her in sickness and in health, his eyes held the memory of those first days when he had cared for her through fever and coughing fits. When Madeline promised the same, she thought of how she had worried through the long days of his absence with the posse. As they exchanged rings her mother's banned for her, a new one purchased in town for him, Madeline felt the circle of their story completing. From desperate strangers to husband and wife in the span of a summer. The celebration afterward at the ranch was joyful, with music from fiddles and guitars, dancing in the yard, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the land that was now as much hers as Kieran's, Madeline found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. Sensing her emotion, Kieran appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. Happy Mrs. Calloway. The name, heard for the first time, sent a thrill through her. More than I thought possible, she admitted. Though I'm still getting used to the idea that this is real, that I'm here married to you on this beautiful ranch. Real as the ground beneath our feet, he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. And permanent as those mountains on the horizon. Later, when the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the master bedroom, now their shared room, Kieran took her face between his hands with infinite tenderness. I've been waiting to tell you something, he said, his voice low and intimate. The day I found you by that creek, I wasn't supposed to be there at all. I was headed in the opposite direction to check on cattle in the south pasture. Madeline tilted her head questioningly. What made you change course? A feeling, he said simply. Something pulling me north instead. I've never been able to explain it, but now I think I understand. What do you understand? She whispered, her hands resting on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her palms. That some things are meant to be, he replied. That sometimes the universe conspires to put you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. As he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership, Madeline silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought her, coughing and desperate, into the path of this extraordinary man who had whispered easy and changed her life forever. 5 years later, Madeline sat on the porch of Calloway Ranch, watching her husband teaching their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their infant daughter, Elizabeth, slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Kieran's cattle operation had expanded, while Madeline had started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, fulfilling her teaching ambitions in an unexpected way. Mrs. Wilkins, now semi-retired but refusing to leave her family, emerged from the house with lemonade. That boy's going to be a horseman like his father, she observed proudly as little James bounced excitedly in the saddle. And stubborn like him too, Madeline laughed. He insisted on the biggest pony, even though his feet barely reach halfway down its sides. Calloway determination, Mrs. Wilkins nodded sagely. Gets them through the hard times. The hard times had come, as they do in any life. Drought had threatened the herd 2 summers ago. Madeline had lost a baby between James and Elizabeth, a grief that had tested their strength. But through it all, their love had only deepened, tempered by challenges rather than weakened by them. When Kieran finished the riding lesson and carried a tired but triumphant James back to the house, his face lit with the same smile that had captured Madeline's heart that first day by the creek. He bent to kiss her, then the top of their daughter's downy head. "My family," he said, the simple words containing a universe of emotion. Sometimes at night, Madeline still dreamed of the stagecoach robbery, waking with a phantom cough in her throat. And always Kieran would be there, offering water, whispering easy until her breathing calmed. It had become more than a word between them, it was a reminder of beginnings, of care freely given, of love that had started with a chance encounter on the wild Dakota plains. As the sun set behind the hills of the land they now shared, Madeline looked at her husband and children, and thought how strange and wonderful life's journey could be. She had traveled west seeking a new start, never imagining that her true destination would be found not in Deadwood, but in the arms of a cowboy who had poured water between her lips when she couldn't stop coughing, and whispered a single word that had changed everything. Easy.